Regardless of time of arrival or place of origin, Racine's immigrants have undergone a strikingly similar process of adjustment to life in urban industrial America. Most entered at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Each suffered at least some degree of prejudice and discrimination in housing, employment, education, and recreation. Before there were niggers to despise, there were Polacks, Hunkies, Dagos, and Kikes, and before that, Micks, Krauts, Norskis, and Bohunks. All too sought to retain as much of their ethnic identity and culture as they could, while Americanizing to earn a living. To achieve these goals, each ethnic group has relied upon a remarkably similar set of institutions, which they either imported from the old world or developed in the new. The most important of these have been the extended family, the ethnic neighborhood, the church, the parochial school, the fraternal, benevolent, and cultural societies, and the foreign language newspaper. Let's look at each of these in turn.
Hello, I'm John Buenker. The extended family generally were large and closely knit, including not only parents and children, but grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Relatives were nearby to borrow money or food, house extra guests, help out in sickness, accident, or death, care for children, give advice, or simply argue. Among most immigrant groups, the family was extremely paternalistic. The father earned the money and made and enforced the decisions. Mother had complete charge of the house and the care and the rearing of the children. The latter's main job was to obey, grow, and prepare themselves for a better standard of living than that enjoyed by their parents. Advancement through education was the rule in most immigrant families. When we got into trouble in school, an Italian-American woman reminisced, we were in double trouble. My father assumed the teacher was always right, and therefore we were automatically wrong. He would simply punish us again. The mother, on the other hand, was to provide the children with softness and love, to give them the sweet life while they are young.
The family usually worked together, played together, and stuck together against outsiders. Its members tended gardens for vegetables, cured their own meat, and kept a variety of animals. The Irish and Germans in the Fourth Ward once had so many animals running wild that the city council passed an ordinance against the practice. A Racine woman of Hungarian descent remembered that her family kept cows, chickens, geese, and pigs on their lakeside property, and that she fed the geese on the land where the giant case plant now stands. Most families also made beer or wine in their home, a practice continued with great difficulty, even during the days of Prohibition. The neighborhoods were almost self-contained units where a family could find nearly all the necessities and amenities of life. We played together, we went to school together, we shared each other's problems, and we never went out of the neighborhood for entertainment, an Italian-American woman recalled. Everyone knew everyone. The parents knew all the kids in the area, and the kids knew all the parents. In the age before the automobile, television, radio, and the movies, and in an era when most neighborhoods contained small family businesses of every description, the immediate neighborhood formed most of the boundaries of life. Neighbors often exchanged food, clothing, and other items to add variety and increase longevity. Many immigrants kept boarders, usually adult male laborers trying to earn enough to send for their families, a practice that helped pay for the purchase of large houses. In good weather, life was lived largely out of doors. Block parties were a common form of recreation. Children played in the streets or on nearby playgrounds, while the older people visited on porches and street corners. Many neighborhoods had open-air markets where residents and nearby farmers brought their produce and handicraft to be bought and sold. By the 1920s, most neighborhoods had a movie theater within walking distance, which occasionally showed foreign language films of interest to one of its nationalities. The world entered by Racine's blacks and Chicanos was one that made it difficult for them to get the same benefits out of the family and the neighborhood as social institutions. The automobile made people far more mobile. It and the changing nature of the economy all but destroyed most neighborhood shops and stores. Radio and television gave people a much broader focus and distracted their time and attention from neighborhood matters. City ordinances and the lack of land made growing food and keeping animals impractical. School consolidation and busing erased neighborhood boundary lines and distributed pupils all over the city and county. The old neighborhood focus and sense of belonging was fast disappearing. The family, too, was undergoing significant change, with more mothers working outside the home and children showing increasing independence. Social Security, welfare, and unemployment and workmen's compensation were largely substituted for voluntary help from neighbors and relatives. Many black families, nearly 20% in 1970, suffered the additional problem of having no male head of household, a legacy of over 300 years of slavery and job discrimination. Spanish-speaking families were cast much more in the traditional European mold of paternalism. All these circumstances, combined with poverty and discrimination, accounted for the fact that the 3 inner-city census tracts in 1965 had far more than half the city's total of delinquency, illegitimacy, crime, aid to dependent children, public and old age assistance, and medical indigency. In the face of this large-scale social disorganization, it is still too early to tell whether Racine's blacks and Chicanos will be able to construct anything like the family and neighborhood structures of earlier arrivals, or whether they will rely even more heavily upon other institutions and practices. Equally important to Racine's various immigrant groups have been their religious institutions. Religion was one of the strongest ties that immigrant groups could maintain with the old country and was a vital part of their national culture. By and large, it has been the most enduring piece of their cultural baggage. Racine's present-day religious diversity is the most visible heritage left by successive waves of newcomers. The church also kept alive the national language long after it had been dropped everywhere else. Most groups retained foreign language services until the 2nd or 3rd generation. Churches not only provided for immigrant spiritual needs, but also served as social and recreational centers, providing dances, socials, athletic teams, suppers, and young people's organizations. Church halls were the usual meeting places for a variety of ethnic organizations, and typical turn-of-the-century city directories contained nearly 4 pages of church-sponsored organizations. The Catholic and Lutheran churches in the old country even sent financial aid, as well as works of art, books, hymnals, and vestments. They also provided clergy to minister to their compatriots. Clergymen were usually prominent intellectual, cultural, and even political leaders of any ethnic community. The church also helped new arrivals find jobs and housing, counseled families, aided widows and orphans, and cared for the sick. Most families organized nearly their entire social and recreational life around the church calendar, and holy days were the social highlights of the year. The construction of a church building was one of the first orders of business for any ethnic group, even though this often meant considerable economic sacrifice on the part of the communicants. Frequently, the men and boys built much of the structure with their own hands, while the women provided food and drink.
The first churches in Racine were established by the Yankees, who brought their Congregational, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, and Unitarian religions with them. The English, Scottish, and Welsh immigrants generally professed these same faiths. The church was one of the major institutions that merged the 2 population sources. Still, some Presbyterian churches remained largely Scottish, and the Welsh maintained separate houses of worship even into the 20th century. The Welsh Methodist and Presbyterian churches merged during the Civil War, while the Welsh Congregational Church remained distinct until the 1930s. Only then did they agree to drop their Old World language for services and to admit non-Welsh members, thus facilitating a merger with the Plymouth Congregational Church.
The early predominance of Yankee and British worshipers meant that over 80% of the city's population in 1850 was Baptist, Congregationalist, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, or Methodist. A century later, immigration had produced almost that high a percentage of Roman Catholics and Lutherans.
The Catholic Church in Racine was established primarily by the Germans and the Irish, and to a lesser extent the Bohemians. The first 2 groups founded St. Luke's on Haymarket Square in 1842, and later moved to 8th and Lake Streets, changing the name to St. Ignatius. Disagreements over language and ritual eventually led the Germans to build St. Mary's in 1852, while the Irish established St. Patrick's 4 years later. Their national ties were so strong that North Side Germans walked past St. Patrick's, crossed the river, and continued all the way to St. Mary's,
while Southside Irish made the opposite journey to St. Patrick's. The founding of St. Joseph's at Erie and St. Patrick Streets in 1862 and St. Rose's at 12th and Grand in 1885 gave German and Irish Catholics places of worship on both sides of the river. German and Irish Catholics were responsible for the establishment of churches in Waterford, Burlington, Caledonia, and Dover. Bohemian Catholics worshipped at St. Louis Church in Caledonia or at St. Joseph's, both German parishes, until the building of St. John Nepomuk in 1896.
The Lutheran Church owed its existence primarily to the Germans and the Scandinavians. The first German evangelical Lutheran church at 7th and Grand in 1848 was the mother of German Lutheranism, helping to found such other churches as St. Paul's, Emmanuel, and St. John's. The Scandinavian Evangelical Lutheran Church was founded by Norwegians and Danes in the late 1840s. As the number of Danes increased, it eventually became the first Danish Lutheran church in America, taking the name Emmaus in 1872. Disputes over language, doctrine, and representation on the board caused the Norwegians to split off and establish Bethesda 2 years later. Like the first German, Emmaus became the mother, both willing and unwilling, of several other Danish Lutheran churches, including Our Savior, Emmanuel, and Gethsemane. The Norwegians established Zion in 1912 and other Lutheran congregations at Norway, North Cape, and Vernon. Swedish Lutherans completed the foundation of that church by constructing Messiah in 1906.
Although Catholicism and Lutheranism were the religious mainstreams of the old immigration, there were important tributaries. The Germans established Baptist, Congregational, Evangelical, United Brethren, and Church of God denominations, while the Danes founded Baptist and Methodist congregations. The Swedes built a Methodist church in 1885, and the Norwegians cooperated with the Danes in founding 2 other Methodist congregations in 1858 and 1890. The Bohemians had a Presbyterian church near LaSalle and High, and perhaps half their number rejected organized religion in favor of free thinking. The latter originated in their homeland as a defense against the Catholicism of the Austrian Empire and was brought to Racine by such liberal intellectuals as Carol Jonas and Martin Secor. The latter expressed an important part of their outlook in the epitaph on his tombstone: "The world is my home, to do good is my religion. Why did a good God create a bad devil?" The Dutch completed the old immigrant religious experience by establishing 2 Reformed churches.
The influx of Southern and Eastern Europeans and the passage of generations altered the city's religious picture in several important ways after 1900. The new immigrants brought with them several heretofore unrepresented denominations: the Greek and Serbian Orthodox, the Armenian Apostolic, and the Jewish. Each of the Christian denominations founded a separate church, with the Armenians eventually splitting into St. Mesrob's and St. Hagab's. The church is their spiritual home, a prominent Greek woman testified. It is their social home. It is where they go to reaffirm their Greekness. The same could fairly be said of other national churches. The Jews founded an Orthodox congregation, B'nai Yehuda, in the 1890s, which served as the sole place of worship for that group until about 1915, when a split along generational and ideological lines led to the formation of the conservative Beth Israel and the Reformed Sinai congregations. In 1925, all but some of the older generation merged into the Congregation Beth Israel Sinai, its doctrine and ritual an amalgam of compromises endorsed by men dedicated to unity. Other new immigrant groups contributed significantly to the expansion of the Catholic Church in Racine by the foundation of St. Kazimierz Lithuanian, St. Stanislaus Polish, Holy Trinity Slovak, Sacred Heart Italian, and St. Lucy Italian and Hungarian. Lithuanian Catholics spent 10 years raising funds in $1 donations, while the Poles began a building fund with 11 members who pooled $11 in the pot. Both Italian Catholic churches were built primarily by the labor of their own communicants, and Sacred Heart parishioners sold bricks to help pay expenses. A small minority among these predominantly Catholic nationalities pursued Protestant faiths, such as the Hungarian Evangelical and Reformed, the Italian Baptist and Evangelical, and the Slovak Baptist. The Slovaks were the only new immigrant group to found a Lutheran church, even though small numbers of that denomination existed among nearly every Eastern European nationality. As the old immigrants moved north and west before the new, many of their churches, especially the Lutheran, followed them. Some moved physically out of the old neighborhoods and built new churches, while others established daughter or missionary churches in the area of second settlement. These new congregations usually had less of a national affiliation than the earlier ones because of intermarriage and residential mobility. Increasingly, most old immigrant churches abandoned foreign language services as the younger generation lost the facility to use the mother tongue. The Lutheran Church began to establish English language churches as early as the 1880s, and Redeemer became the first such congregation in Racine in 1889.
Nearly all the churches established after 1900 used English either exclusively or with the mother tongue. Eventually, most of the new immigrant churches followed suit, although many continued to use the native language for special services. The Greeks, Armenians, and Serbians, however, have largely retained the use of their language in worship to the present day.
The city's black community had two churches dating from pre-Civil War days, Wayman African Methodist Episcopal and St. Paul's Baptist, both located in the area of 12th and Grand. St. Mark's and St. Augustine's Episcopal churches also had largely Negro congregations. The mass migration of blacks added several more Baptist and Methodist churches, as well as introduced a variety of other denominations. Chief among these were the Church of God in Christ, the Church of God, the Church of Christ, the United Holy Church of America, and the Muslims. Many of these purchased church buildings abandoned by earlier white groups who had moved to other parts of the city. The vast majority of Mexican Americans were Roman Catholic, and the Milwaukee Archdiocese first responded to the influx by creating Guadalupe Chapel, a mission on Durand Avenue just north of the barrio in the 1950s. It was jointly staffed by St. Joseph's Church and the St. Vincent de Paul Society and provided religious instruction, recreation, health, and a Spanish language newspaper. As most Chicanos moved into the city, they settled in St. Patrick's Parish, and the old Irish church responded by the establishment of a Spanish service and the creation of the Cristo Rey Pastoral Center that gave courses in English, sewing, cooking, and driver's education, provided recreational facilities, and ran a referral service for public assistance and employment.
Closely allied to their concern for religion has been the importance that Racine's ethnic minorities have attached to achieving an education. On the one hand, education has been seen as the most likely avenue for social mobility for their children, as a ticket to a professional or managerial position. On the other hand, it was highly valued as a means of preserving Old World language and culture and of inculcating religious and ethical values. The public schools offered a convenient and economical means of fulfilling the former ambition, but they were seriously deficient as a vehicle for achieving the latter goal. Most Native Americans, either out of a prejudice or a sincere belief that it was for the students' own good, viewed the public schools as vehicles for Americanizing and Protestantizing minorities. Teachers were often not satisfied until they had stripped away the last vestiges of foreignness from their students, even if this meant alienating them from families and compatriots. Accordingly, every ethnic group in Racine found it necessary to either supplement a public school education or to supply an alternative. Many Protestant groups found the public schools basically compatible and contented themselves with the establishment of Sunday schools, where they stressed religious instruction and the basics of their language and culture. Jews, too, sent their children to public schools during the week and to scripture school on the weekends.
Catholics and Lutherans, however, constructed full-fledged parochial school systems that ran through the elementary and secondary grades and provided their children's complete educational experience. These were attached to and administered by the church. Such a course was often expensive, especially for working-class people, but the goal of maintaining a distinctive religion, language, and culture justified the cost. A Polish American later recalled his education at St. Stanislaus School, an experience typical of many parochial school students. We had a Polish language, Polish literature, Polish math, if you can figure that out, and Polish religion. There'd be a half hour of lessons in Polish, followed by a half hour of lessons in English. The Catholic parochial system was aided immensely by the arrival of a group of German Dominican nuns led by Mother Benedicta Bauer in 1862. This order staffed most of the city's parochial schools for many decades and established St. Catherine's High School and Dominican College. A group of Polish Franciscans founded St. Bonaventure's School just outside Sturtevant in 1917. Lutherans, both Danish and German, emulated the Catholic experience in the creation of church-related schools and even established Luther College in 1900 on a hill above Horlick Park. It ran until 1912 and had an enrollment of about 100 students. In 1944, the city's Lutherans built Lutheran High School on Spring Street just below Luther Hill. In 1911, the Catholic and Lutheran parochial schools combined enrolled about 1/4 of the city's school children, and by 1955, the figure had risen to about 30%. Many Lutheran churches later abandoned their schools, but in 1975 there were still close to 6,000 students enrolled in the city's Catholic schools. In addition to their parochial schools, Racine County Danes also participated in a folk school farm program, which expressed its purpose in 1944. We believe that an individual is not a farmer one day and a citizen the next. Therefore, we are trying to observe unifying educational principles which will help these young men to think of all phases of society, to consider their own lives as a whole, and to regard their citizenship as an everyday affair. In 1888, Bohemians in Caledonia established a national school on 5 Mile Road, designed to teach their national language and culture to public school students on the weekend. It lasted until 1916, when it became a meeting hall, and has just recently been reopened by the Junior League and the Racine County Historical Museum. The Dutch community also established the Racine Christian School under the auspices of the Christian Reformed Church. The city's black and Mexican Americans generally share their earlier counterparts' devotion to education as an avenue of social mobility and a preserver of culture, but for largely financial reasons have relied primarily upon the public school system. Only a few Mexican families send their children to existing parochial schools. The overwhelming majority of both groups interviewed in a recent survey listed the schools as the only or the most important place of learning. The lower the income of the Mexican Americans and the Negroes, the greater the emphasis on school as a place of learning. The usefulness of public schools to the city's minorities was severely limited by the existence of de facto segregation. 70% of Mexican children and 3/4 of blacks attended only 4 schools in 1960. By 1971, these concentrations were beginning to break down because of redistribution and busing. Besides relying upon Sunday school to transmit their culture, blacks and Mexican Americans have sought to persuade the public school system to adopt multicultural and bilingual programs.
Racine's newcomers also constructed a complex network of fraternal and benevolent societies which made it possible for them to satisfy almost every basic human need within the confines of the ethnic community. These were often formed by people from the same village or region, but usually expanded to include all members of that nationality. As intermarriage with other nationalities became more common, they invited spouses and children who were not totally of that national group to join. In some cases, religious differences led to the retention of separate societies. Whatever their other varied functions, all provided companionship with one's fellow countrymen, the opportunity to reminisce about the old country or the problems of the new in the native tongue, aided by ethnic food and drink. They provided a haven from the stark world of labor, deprivation, and prejudice which was encountered daily, an opportunity to observe the ancient customs and traditions. Many of these organizations were directly affiliated with the church: altar and rosary societies, missionary clubs, young men's and women's groups, sodalities, and holy name societies. These enabled a person to socialize with his friends and neighbors while advancing the cause of his religion.
Many other societies did not serve a strictly religious function, but were often affiliated with or sponsored by the church and met in the parish hall. Chief among these were the benevolent societies, which were begun by the old immigrants and copied by the new. Living in a world without Social Security, unemployment insurance, and workmen's compensation, immigrants, like most other Americans, had to rely upon private arrangements to protect themselves and their families against the unexpected. Private insurance companies usually charge premiums that few wage earners or small businessmen could afford, so most ethnic groups undertook to provide these benefits for themselves. Members of the Benevolent Society paid a reasonable initiation fee plus small monthly or weekly dues. In the event of sickness or accident to the breadwinner, the society paid out a benefit to tide the family over. If a member died, his survivors received a much larger death benefit. Many societies also had burial arrangements whereby they purchased a plot of ground and covered funeral expenses. Most benevolent societies began as small local organizations, and many never grew out of that stage. As the group became more prosperous, the need for such activities often grew less acute, and compulsory government programs gradually took their place. Others grew in size and assets, affiliated with national ethnic organizations, invested their members' dues, and became prosperous fraternal insurance companies, paying dividends as well as sick and death benefits. The local benevolent societies often performed other welfare functions, finding jobs and housing for new arrivals, protecting greenhorns from exploitation by foremen, businessmen, or swindlers, providing food and clothing to the victims of fires or natural disasters. Ethnic societies also served needs that were less basic, but still vital to one's growth as a human being. Literary societies collected books in the Old World language and sponsored lectures and discussions on topics of interest. Some larger ethnic groups were able to publish newspapers, newsletters, or literary magazines to inform the community of Old World developments, interpret American events from an ethnic perspective, influence voting behavior, and serve as an outlet for talented writers. Many fraternal societies also indulged their members' interests in music, sponsoring orchestras, bands, and dancing and singing groups, which specialized in the musical tradition of the old country. Ethnic societies also staged dramatic presentations, usually in the mother tongue. All of these provided the community with wholesome entertainment, helped preserve its national identity and cultural heritage, and served as a useful outlet for the energies of adults and children. For the more athletically inclined, national societies like the German Turners, Polish Falcons, or Czech and Slovak Sokols provided facilities for gymnastics and related activities. In time, most ethnic organizations and churches also sponsored the full range of American sports for their members. Finally, fraternal societies defended the group against discrimination and prejudice, counteracting bias and propaganda with more reliable information, and exerting group pressure on businesses and other organizations which discriminated against their members. In time, nearly all these diverse functions were consolidated into one or two all-purpose societies, housed under one roof, whether in a church hall or one built expressly for that purpose.
In 1867, the Danes established the first chapter of Dania for the primary purpose of teaching English to immigrants. Its motto was, "In unity, there is strength." It pledged to educate its members in music, debating, public speaking, language, science, dramatics, and art, and to give financial and moral support in case of sickness, death, or misfortune, to support worthy causes, and to promote American citizenship. It paid up to 6 months of sick benefits for annual dues, as well as a death benefit. In time, Dania also acquired a library of several thousand volumes, a large hall for plays and dances, a billiard and game room, bowling alley, meeting room, and kitchen. By 1905, it had already enrolled 675 members and later showed Danish movies and sponsored a soccer team. In 1879, a group of Dania women organized the 10-cent Society, which collected dues in that amount at each meeting and contributed to various charitable causes, especially to the care of widows and orphans of Danish immigrants. At its height, it had nearly 500 members. In 1878, a group of veterans from the Danish-German wars founded a Veterans Society, which evolved into the Danish Brotherhood in 1882. It had almost 850 members by 1912 and was the charter lodge of almost 150 in the nation. Although primarily a fraternal benefit society, the Danish Brotherhood also had an extensive library and put on plays, dances, and musical entertainment. Its Hamlet Singing Society, like the Dania Glee Club, specialized in Old World music, while its sisterhood, founded in 1886, concentrated upon charitable and cultural activities. Both organizations also had young people's societies to prepare youths for later membership. Even after the exodus of Danes to West Racine, both organizations remained in the area of first settlement, Dania on State Street and the Danish Brotherhood at Washington and Grand. Although Although St. Luke's Hospital had been founded in 1871 as a charitable institution of the Protestant Episcopal Church, the Danish Hospital Association took over its operation from 1891 to 1906. In 1927, nearly all Danish organizations and churches combined to form the Old People's Home Association, which required dues of $1 from its members. By 1933, they had collected enough money to open a home on Milwaukee Avenue. For many years, the Danish community sponsored the annual Kringle Festival in West Racine's Kringleville on the first Sunday of August. Bearing the Danish and American flags, the procession moved to the picnic grounds while speakers extolled the courage of the Danish people and reviewed their achievements in this country. Bands played Danish airs, the Danish Sisterhood Glee Club sang folk songs. Grundlov's Day, the anniversary of Danish independence, was also an important day in the community, but nothing surpassed the visit of King Frederick, an event attended by over 30,000 people in 1939. When Adolf Hitler invaded Denmark the following year, the city went into official mourning and Danish and American flags flew at half-staff on most buildings. The Danes also contributed to Racine culture through the Danish Hour radio show hosted by Peter Bach, which ran for over 24 years. Bach played classical and semi-classical music and supplied his listeners with Danish culture and world affairs. During the war, he broadcast news of interest to the German-occupied Danes, a feat for which he received both the Royal Gold Medal and the King Christian Medal for Liberation.
Most of the Bohemian organizations in Racine originated with the community of free thinkers and 48ers who settled on the north side and in Caledonia. The local branch of the Bohemian Society of America was founded in 1854 and became Slovanska Lipa, Linden Tree, a society dedicated to education, mutual help, and defense of the homeland in 1861. 10 years later, fellow nationals established the first Sokol, a gymnasium society originating in the Old Country, to give discipline, confidence, and physical strength against the Austrian occupation. The following year, Caledonia Bohemians founded a social organization called Tabor, which later evolved into the Česká Caledonia. In 1878, the Sokol and the Slovanska Lipa affiliated with the Czech National Union, a group dedicated to aiding immigrants and maintaining a Sunday school. By the 1890s, nearly all of these had merged into the Czech Slavic Benevolent Society, which constructed a combination meeting room and athletic facility that still stands on Lincoln Street. In addition to the numerous functions already described, the CSPS maintained the Lyra Singing Society, a dramatic group, and the Tabor Sokol Union, the local branch of the Sokol Union. It also included young people's organizations, several chapters of the Czech Women's Organization, and of Osveta, a cultural society, and a burial society.
In 1906, Racine's Bohemians raised $5,000 to plant a statue at High and Milwaukee Streets in honor of Karel Jonas. Although he had not seen his native land for almost half a century, Jonas requested the following epitaph: "I have but one wish, bury me in the loved Czech land, for which I have fervently longed and for which I have sacrificed all." In 1917, Racine Czechs played an active role in the Czech National Alliance, which raised money and lobbied for the creation of an independent Czechoslovakia after World War I. Catholic Czechs relied more upon their church for organizational strength, operating largely through the St. John Nepomuk Society, which had fraternal and benefit functions as well as raising money to build a national church. In 1896, they established a chapter of the Bohemian Catholic Central Union, and in 1911, a branch of the Bohemian Catholic Union Sokol, a group entirely of American origin, although it has its background in the Old Country and manifests the same cultural interests as the movement there. Many present-day Czechs still belong to the American Czech Club.
National societies or vereins also abounded among Racine's Germans, headed by the Turnverein, an athletic society similar to the Sokol. Their benevolent societies nursed the sick, buried the dead, helped widows and orphans, aided the missions, ran employment, travelers' aid, and immigration bureaus, while their cultural organizations provided music and drama and sponsored the bands of Jacob Esser and Adolf Schulte.
In 1894, nearly all the city's German societies combined to create the German Men's Club. Among others, it united the Harmony Singing Society, the Goethe Dramatic Club, the Germania Sports Club, the Racine Soccer Club, various women's societies, the Veterans Club, the Northside Young Men's Society, and numerous Catholic and Lutheran groups.
Racine City Germans also created the German Women's Club and sponsored German Day on October 8th, which featured food, sports, parades, concerts, and dances.
Burlington Germans founded the Teutonic Society in 1853, and its members hauled stones on borrowed slaves to build Teutonia Hall in 1871. Until it burned in 1930, it was the center of German community life and the site of the annual Familienfests. The Irish structured their organizational life around church societies and provided culture and economic security through the Young Men's Literary and Benevolent Society and the Irish Catholic Benevolent Society, all of which met at Father Matthew Hall at St. Patrick's Church. Along with their German co-religionists, the Irish played a major role in founding a variety of Catholic organizations, such as the Knights of Columbus, the Catholic Knights, and the St. Vincent de Paul Society. To care for the sick and bury the dead, the Irish founded the ancient order of Hibernians. The big Irish social event of the year was the St. Patrick's Day celebration in the 4th Ward. The Hibernians, dressed in high hats, green sashes, and sporting sabers, marched from Monument Square to Father Matthew Hall. The parade was really something, a longtime Irish resident recalled. We wore those beautiful outfits and always started out in step. But before the parade ended, there weren't so many of us walking straight. Tradition has it that the parade often ended with a fight at the Main Street Bridge, caused by the taunts of non-Irish hecklers. The day concluded at the hall with songs, jigs, square dancing, and lots of Irish oratory. Although the parade died out many decades ago, about 150 Irish Americans have sought to celebrate St. Patrick's Day in a more subdued fashion at the Shamrock Club. The smaller old immigrant groups also established fraternal and benevolent societies, with the Norwegians founding the Sons of Norway in 1917 and administering Colonel Haig Memorial Park in the town of Norway. The Swedes established Gustav Vasa Lodge in 1912, and the Scots founded the Caledonia Society in 1877, while the Welsh added the St. David Benevolent Society in 1889 and the Kimmerik Club 4 years later. Their Eisteddfod, a literary and art festival, was the annual cultural event in the 3rd Ward. Southern and Eastern Europeans readily emulated the organizations of Racine's old immigrants. Northside and Lakeside Italians, for example, began with separate societies before they merged into the Roma Lodge, a combined benefit and cultural society. The city's Italians regularly celebrated Columbus Day and the Feast of the Assumption on August 15th by religious observances, games, dancing, and feasts. Even before the major wave of Polish migration, the earliest arrivals formed the John Sobieski Society to provide fellowship and benevolence and to collect money for the building of St. Stanislaus Church. In 1905, they established a chapter of the Polish National Alliance, which not only performed the usual functions, but also sponsored Alliance College in Cambridge Springs, Pennsylvania. Racine and Kenosha Poles raised money, awarded scholarships, and sent their children. Like the Germans and Bohemians, the Poles also had athletic associations, variously referred to as Turners, Sokols, or Falcons. Most Polish organizations were eventually housed at Polish Hall on Mead and Dekoven. The war veterans met at Polish Veterans Hall in Kenosha. Together with their compatriots from Milwaukee and Kenosha, Racine Poles sponsored an annual debutantes ball at Milwaukee's Tuckaway Country Club, and in 1929 honored American Revolutionary heroes Tadeusz Kosciuszko and Casimir Pulaski with a monument in Washington Park. Small Hungarian societies eventually merged with the construction of Hungarian Hall in 1922. These provided members with economic benefits and offered athletic and recreational opportunities, especially the annual Harvest Festival each fall. Other celebrations marked the Feast of St. Stephen, patron of Hungary, and the anniversary of this unsuccessful 1848 revolution. In 1952, Hungarian women formed a club for displaced persons of their nationality, which engaged in various fundraising drives, including the sewing of a giant flag of St. Stephen, the national emblem, prior to Russian occupation. Racine's Lithuanians also belonged to a variety of organizations, varying from dramatic and singing societies to benefit associations, most of which met at Lithuanian Brotherhood Hall at 12th and Herrick. In 1941, most of these organizations affiliated with the Lithuanian American Council, which raised $10,000 to aid their Old World countrymen during World War II and to sponsor refugees to the United States. Greeks, Armenians, and Jews centered their organizational life around their respective churches. The Hellenic Society focused on cultural activities, while the Armenian General Benevolent Union and the Armenian Relief Society aided refugees of the genocide and provided a variety of welfare benefits for fellow countrymen. The Armenian Revolutionary Federation and similar groups are dedicated to procuring national independence while preserving the Armenian heritage in America.
Despite their relatively small numbers, Racine's Jews created a wide variety of organizations. In 1908, they formed a cemetery association, requiring members to contribute 90 cents every 3 months, and by 1918 had an accumulated store of pennies that enabled them to purchase land near Osborne and Graceland Boulevards. By 1926, the cemetery was divided between the Orthodox B'nai Yehuda and the conservative Reform Beth Israel Sinai. In 1911, Racine got the local chapter of B'nai B'rith, Sons of the Covenant, an organization concerned with social services, youth work, civic improvement, anti-defamation, and adult education. For years, it sponsored a free employment bureau in keeping with the design of being a soothing force of mercy, charity, and virtue. The following year, they established the Zionist organization dedicated to the recreation of a Jewish state in Palestine.
For its young people, B'nai B'rith organized AZA, while Jewish women fostered basic Jewish education as a background for intelligent and creative Jewish living through Hadassah, which means joyful mother of children. Racine's blacks and Mexican Americans have followed the established practice of organizational activity. 19th century blacks established a number of cultural, religious, benefit, and athletic societies, and their 20th century descendants functioned largely through the NAACP and the Urban League. The former worked to end all barriers to racial injustice and guarantee full equality of opportunity and achievement in the United States, while the latter dealt more with the day-to-day problems of housing, jobs, and the adjustment of new arrivals.
Mexican Americans have faced the same problems and have had to deal with the same agencies while trying to perpetuate their culture. Some of the earliest organizations were the Cajadamor Club, the Spanish American Civic Club, and the Latin American Women's Club. Since 1967, they have operated through La Raza Unida, People United, the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, the Racine Spanish Center, and the Mexican American Political Education Committee. Since 1972, La Raza Unida has concentrated on social services such as jobs, housing, education, food cooperatives, and help for migrant farm workers, while LULAC has engaged primarily in nonpartisan political action and protesting discrimination.
The Spanish Center ministers to the physical needs of Chicanos, while the Cristo Rey Ministry looks after their spiritual welfare. Festivals mark such occasions as the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Mexican Independence, and Mexican American Day.
These then have been the institutions upon which successive waves of Racine's immigrants have relied to survive and prosper in the new environment. The extended family, the ethnic neighborhood, the church, the parochial school, the fraternal, benevolent, and cultural societies, and the foreign language newspapers provided for many of their physical, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual needs. In the days before Social Security and workmen's compensation, they provided about the only form of economic protection available. In the era before the automobile and the mass media, they formed almost a total environment for most people. Together, they added immensely to the associational life of the city. But no one could live his entire life within the confines of his own ethnic group. Racine's ethnic groups have had to interact with the community outside and to participate in the political life of the city, state, and nation. In the final segment of our study of Racine's ethnic groups, we will focus on their political impact, on their interaction with the more established institutions, and on the possible meaning of Racine's own immigrant experience.